There is a conversation that happens in some homes before a child even turns 10 years old, and it is a conversation that never happens in most others. It is not about grades, it is not about manners. It is about money, power, and identity. And by the time that child turns 18, they see the world in a completely different way than everyone around them. This is not luck. This is not privilege in the way you think. This is training. And once you understand what is actually being taught behind closed doors in wealthy households, you will never look at success the same way again. Stick with me for the next few minutes because what you're about to hear is not another list of tips you have already heard 100 times. This is the actual psychology, the actual mindset shifts, the actual lessons that separate families who build generational wealth from families who struggle in the same cycle for decades. And if you want more breakdowns like this, one that could genuinely change how you think about money and success, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe, because what comes next might be the most important 7 minutes you spend all week. Let's start with a story. In the 1970s, a boy named Robert grew up in Hawaii with two father figures. One was his biological father, a highly educated man with a good government job. The other was his best friend's father, a man with barely a high school education who ran small businesses. Robert's real father constantly said things like, "I can't afford that." His friend's father, on the other hand, never said those words. Instead, whenever young Robert wanted something, this man would ask a different question. He would say, "How can I afford that?" That single shift from "I can't" to "how can I" became the foundation of everything Robert built later in life. He went on to write one of the best-selling personal finance books in history, and that one phrase from his childhood became the seed of an entire empire of thinking. Here's where things get interesting, because that story is not really about money. It's about the brain. When you say, "I can't afford that," your brain closes a door. It stops searching. It gives you permission to give up. But when you ask, "How can I afford that?" your brain does something completely different. It starts searching for solutions. It stays open. Neuroscientists have studied this exact pattern for years, and the results are almost always the same. The language you use with yourself literally shapes which neural pathways get stronger and which ones get weaker over time. Wealthy parents understand this instinctively, even if they never studied a single page of neuroscience. They know that the words a child repeats to themselves become the walls of the house they will live in for the rest of their life. But that's not the most important part, because language is just the surface. Underneath it is something deeper, something most people never notice. Rich parents teach their kids that money is not the goal. Money is a tool. Average families often treat money like a scarce, sacred, terrifying subject, something you don't talk about at the dinner table. Wealthy families treat money like a subject you study, like math or reading. They talk about it openly. They explain how it works. They let their children see spreadsheets, see investments, see mistakes, see recoveries. And that exposure changes everything. Because what a child is exposed to repeatedly becomes normal to them. And what feels normal becomes what they believe is possible for their own life. Think about the difference between a consumer and a creator. A consumer sees a product and asks, "Can I buy this?" A creator sees the same product and asks, "How was this made? And could I build something like it myself?" Most children are raised to be excellent consumers. They are taught to want things, to save for things, to eventually purchase things. But wealthy families quietly train their children to be creators instead. They ask questions like, "What problem does this solve?" Or, "Who is getting paid here and why?" This is not something taught in a classroom, it's taught in casual conversations, in the car, at the dinner table, during a simple trip to the grocery store. And over years, that repeated questioning rewires how a child sees the entire world. Now, here's something most people never think about: failure. In most households, failure is treated like an emergency. A child gets a bad grade, loses a game, makes a bad decision, and the reaction is panic, punishment, or shame. But in wealthy households, failure is treated completely differently. It's treated as data, as information, as tuition paid toward future success. There's a well-known story about the founder of one of the world's biggest media companies who was fired from her very first television job because producers said she wasn't fit for television. Instead of shrinking from that failure, she used it as fuel, eventually building a media empire worth billions. What made the difference wasn't talent alone. It was the belief, likely instilled early in life, that failure is not identity. Failure is just feedback. This is where the psychology gets really powerful, so stay with me. There's a concept psychologists call locus of control. Some people have what's called an external locus of control. They believe life happens to them. The economy, the government, their boss, their luck, all these outside forces control their outcomes. Other people have an internal locus of control. They believe that no matter the circumstances, their choices and actions are what ultimately shape their life. Guess which one wealthy parents consistently instill in their children? They almost never allow their kids to fall into victim thinking. When something goes wrong, instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they train their children to ask, "What can I learn from this? And what will I do differently next time?" That one mental habit, repeated for 18 years straight, produces a completely different adult than someone raised with constant excuses and blame. Let's pause here for a second, because I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed that some people, when faced with a setback, immediately start problem solving, while others immediately start complaining? That difference did not appear randomly. It was built, brick by brick, moment by moment, mostly during childhood. And the incredible thing is, it can still be rebuilt as an adult. Your current identity is not your final identity. It is simply the identity you've practiced the most so far. Now let's talk about delayed gratification, because this might be the single biggest predictor of long-term success ever studied. In the late 1960s, researchers ran a famous experiment where young children were given one marshmallow and told that if they waited 15 minutes without eating it, they would receive a second marshmallow as a reward. Some children ate it immediately. Others found ways to distract themselves, to wait, to hold out for the bigger reward. Years later, researchers followed up with these same children, now adults, and found a striking pattern. The children who waited tended to have better academic performance, healthier relationships, and stronger financial outcomes later in life. Wealthy parents, whether they've ever heard of this experiment or not, tend to constantly train this exact muscle. They don't hand their children everything instantly. They create small moments of waiting, saving, and earning, over and over, until patience becomes second nature instead of a struggle. But here's what most people never realize about that experiment. It was never really about marshmallows. It was about trust. Children who grew up in unstable or unpredictable environments learned, quite reasonably, to take what they could get immediately, because tomorrow was never guaranteed. Children who grew up in stable, promise-keeping environments learned that waiting usually paid off, because their parents kept their word. This tells us something profound. Discipline is not just a personality trait. It's often a learned response to a consistent, trustworthy environment. And that means, as an adult, you can build that same trust with yourself, one kept promise at a time, one small commitment fulfilled after another, until your own brain starts believing that waiting is worth it too. Let's bring in another story, because I don't want this to feel like a lecture. There was once a young man raised in a modest household who took a summer job at his uncle's company. Instead of just handing him a paycheck, his uncle sat him down and explained where every dollar of the company's revenue actually went, what expenses looked like, what profit margins meant, why certain decisions were made. That teenager didn't become wealthy that summer, but something shifted in how he saw work itself. He stopped seeing a job as just trading hours for a paycheck. He started seeing it as a system, one he could eventually build and control himself instead of only working inside someone else's. Years later, he started his own small business, and he credits that single summer as the moment his entire mindset changed. That is the real lesson. It's rarely about the money handed down. It's about the mental models handed down. If any of this is resonating with you, drop a comment and tell me which lesson hit you the hardest. Because I read through these and it genuinely helps me understand what to cover next. Now let's talk about confidence, because this is where identity really gets built. Wealthy families tend to praise effort and strategy rather than raw talent. Psychologists have found that children praised for being smart often develop what's called a fixed mindset, avoiding challenges because they're afraid of losing that label. But children praised for their effort, their strategy, their persistence, tend to develop a growth mindset, embracing challenges because their identity isn't tied to always being right. Instead, they measure themselves by how much they're willing to try. This is a small shift in language with a massive long-term impact. Because a child who isn't afraid to fail is a child who eventually takes the exact kinds of risks that lead to extraordinary outcomes. And this is where everything starts to connect. The language shift from "I can't" to "how can I?" The willingness to treat failure as feedback instead of identity. The internal locus of control that refuses victim thinking. The patience built through trust and delayed reward. The mental models around money as a tool instead of a mystery. None of these lessons require wealth to teach. None of them require private schools or trust funds or inherited fortunes. They require intention. They require a decision, made consciously, to raise a different kind of thinker. And that means, whether you're a parent or simply someone raising yourself into a new identity right now, these exact same principles are available to you today. Because here's the truth nobody says loud enough. Most so-called rich kid advantages were never really about money at all. They were about psychology, repeated daily, until it became identity. You can start that repetition today, at any age, in any situation. Every time you catch yourself saying, "I can't afford that," pause and ask, "How can I afford that instead?" Every time you fail, resist the urge to internalize it as who you are, and instead extract the lesson buried inside it. Every time you're tempted by instant gratification, remember that the version of you waiting on the other side of patience is always stronger than the version who gave in. If this video gave you even one new way of thinking about success, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the right words at the right moment are enough to shift an entire life's direction. You were not born into a fixed identity. You were born into a set of patterns, and patterns can always be rewritten. The child who grows up hearing, "How can I?" instead of "I can't," becomes an adult who solves problems instead of avoiding them. The child who learns that failure is feedback becomes an adult who takes the risks that others are too afraid to take. And the child who learns patience through trust becomes an adult capable of building something that lasts far longer than any quick win ever could. None of that requires inheritance. It only requires a decision to think differently, starting right now with the very next thought you choose to believe. That is the real inheritance. And starting today, it's yours to claim.